Well, thank you for the overview of the background. What I'd like to do now, if that's all right, is talk a little bit about the miniatures range. As a dyed-in-the-wool hobby goober myself, I'm really excited to see the array of models that have come out, that are part of this Dark Eldar release. And it's quite mind-blowing in the scale of, at the time the Codex comes out, we're going to be sort of swarmed by great new Dark Eldar miniatures. It's very comprehensive. How does it come about? How do you go about making such a big and sort of uniform-looking range?
Well, yeah, it can be uniform in some ways because we got the chance to start again. Right. It was quite a blank sheet of paper, actually, for the whole thing. But Phil and I, we went over the troop types and we sort of sat and discussed each one of them and found that there was still something very strong in each one of those. There wasn't very many that we just wanted to jump, because we could have done. We could have just sort of like started from scratch. But actually their names had a lot of resonance. What they did on the battlefield had a lot of resonance. And the trick was to try and make a unified army out of the whole thing. We had certain themes that we wanted to, but who's not going to jump at the chance of completely redesigning something from the ground up? The models are really old, and just being able to do all of it, that's just a fantastic thing to be handed.
Great, thank you. So if you look across the range, and I've had the opportunity to play with a few of the models with you the other week, and one of the things that really strikes me is that this incredibly posable nature. Lots of bits can be moved across from one plastic set to another.
Yeah, that's not necessarily a sort of like aesthetic feature, but we want to do that from the ground up. I mean, if you look at our marine ranges, for instance, there's a huge amount of ability to swap pieces from one from another, and we wanted to do the same thing with this, in that when you look at the witches, because they have one armoured side from the gladiatorial stuff, it gave us the opportunity to do most of the sort of special weapons for the leaders with an armoured sleeve. Making that very similar to the warrior one meant you can swap a lot of those pieces. All the fittings are the same, so you can steal bits from one to another, particularly things like the heads and stuff. And we've tried to include a huge amount of sort of helmets and heads on the frame, so that although the basic warriors and witches as plastic box sets are going to be a huge part of your army, there are a lot of options, a lot of ways of sticking them together, and a lot of ways of swapping bits between them to use things.
Sure. Well, I was playing with the warriors set, and there's dozens of different, far more combinations of ways you can put them on, and different heads and limbs and extra accessories and things you can put on than you can do with one box. You're never going to use all of it on your first squad, and then when you add, I guess, that extra layer on, does that spread across into the other plastic kits?
Yeah, the raiders in particular, we've made sure that all the fittings are the same, and we've put new heads and new helmets on there, so you can mix bits from the raider crew that are hanging off the things, little monkey hangers, with the other ones on those.
It's probably a good place to start talking about some of these test models. Yeah. I was just leaving the raider for a second. I was just looking at some of Jez's tests for the sort of re-envisaging of the Dark Eldar, and they're really quite close to the final product. It must be.
Yeah, they're not far off, really. I mean, I had to make compromises with those, but I mean, this was a long while ago. What we started with was 2 basic warriors, which Phil's got there. I also did a rough mock-up for the jet cycles, the jet bikes, the Hellions, and the Raider, which is this little fellow over here, which is very, very crude, and you can see it's got pencil on it, and it's got little blobby people with no faces, just to show what we did. And probably the interesting part of that one was that we wanted to, they've got open-top transports. They've always had open-top transports. We wanted to keep some of the elements of the Raider in that sort of like flying trireme type thing. But we wanted it to be a lot more dynamic and a lot more Eldar, and to actually look quite neat. And one of the problems that we had with that was the fact that actually we made the old Raider so that you could literally balance all your models on it. So that if it had a squad on it, you got this sort of like thing that was teetering over the place with all your models on, falling off all over the place.
Whenever you put it on a hill or a building, it's like good night there. Yeah. So models fall off, and it just doesn't really work as a design.
So we decided to put some crew in and have those crews so that, I mean, you can see some of them on here. They are actually removable, most of these ones. So the idea is that if you can stick them on if you want, obviously, but you can just hang those onto your model, and that represents the fact that you've got a
crew
squad in
involved,
it.
right? Yeah, perfect.
As soon as you get into combat, you take those guys off and you put your warrior squad down, and then away you go. But actually, that feeds back into one of the things that we wanted to do with the army. Before even we sort of like started designing the majority of it, it was a big conversation with me and Phil as to, right, how does the army work? What does the dynamic look like? What are we going to do with this? Because the figures need to reflect this. And we came very quickly to the idea that we wanted to put as much of it in transports and off the ground as possible. Is that fair to say?
It's very much so. The idea of having an entirely flying army, or an army that starts off, comes up to the table with, and it's just all in gravcraft or on miniature skyboards or on jet bikes. It's really unusual and new flavour to the army. No other army does that, really.
There's only a few units that are actually strictly earthbound.
Yeah, and they almost characterise them a lot.
The
homunculi stuff, like these slow, shambling, kind of horrible, monstrous things.
But you can put those in raiders.
You can stick them in raiders, of course, because it's Dark Eldar.
So you can stick your witches in raiders, you can put your warriors in raiders, you can put incubi in raiders, you can put the homunculi stuff in raiders. But the only things that don't go in there, flying to begin with, are mandrakes, and they've got their own little way of doing things, of coming up through your shadow and stuff, or the Beastmaster stuff. And actually, most of that is so fast going, and the Beastmaster himself gets a skyboard. So we wanted this sort of like this overall feel of a cloud of stuff all the way from these ones. And actually, you know, even though we've not made models of these, we've envisaged the fact that actually somewhere above this, you'd have raiders or slave barges that are this size.
Right.
You know. And we did, and I suppose the other weird thing we decided on that one, we didn't want to do any tanks, did we?
No, the Dark Eldar are not about that sort of overwhelming sort of lumpen armoured silhouette of battle tanky sort of pugnaciousness. I'm not really expressing this very well. Their craft are far more like fast arrows or darts, and they're all about speed as the best defence instead of armour. If you're not there when your opponent's trying to shoot you, that is better armour than being really chunky, right? Yeah. Exactly. So that's the sort of the maxim that these craft live by.
So your main one with that would be the Ravager, which is already, you know, extant in the rules, and effectively it's one of the raiders kitted out as a gunship, so you get your 3 heavy weapons and all the rest of it. But we've also introduced a couple of aircraft which have a very tank-like function as well, lots of missile types, and it's allowed us to do something else that's fast, swept, you know, very aerodynamic.
When you put these together, you put the Raider next to the Ravager, next to the jet bikes and the Hellions and all the sort of sharp, arrow pointy, darty stuff. It looks great on the battlefield. And when you're moving it around, you really feel like making whooshing noises. There's these sort of squadrons of super fast things that zoom. And they do move fast as well. I mean, these leave even the Craftworld Eldar behind. So it's great fun to play with, seriously.
Well, starting from scratch as well meant that we could have a design ethic that went all the way across, so that the shapes of the weapons, the uniforms or costumes, and the vehicles all have a very strong family feel. And actually, that's quite difficult to do anyway, and it's difficult to do if you're doing all the figures yourself. Although I've sort of like done a lot of these ones, it was getting those into the other people that contributed to it. Most of the vehicles were actually done on the computers with CAD programs and with freeform. But I mean, the guys have done a fantastic job in terms of making things all look the same and making them look like the drawings that they got.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, the design aesthetic across the range is incredibly unified, isn't it?
So, I mean, there's over 100 sheets of drawings for these.
You just did a bunch of drawings for the Witches, for example, which were investigating the different weapons that they use, the gladiatorial weapons. We had a great conversation about what would they use in the arenas for attacking the almost sacrificial victims that are put in these gladiatorial arenas. And this has given all the rationale, and the weaponry has kind of given an image that Jez has sketched out in various different ways, which have then translated into the models themselves, quite faithfully. And as a result, the models have a real style to them. I think the style and flair of this range is just, I think it's just fantastic. I'm really impressed by the way it's all come together, got to say.
Yeah, no, but say I don't know. This is years now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Basically, but sitting around talking about. Well, I mean, a conversation can go anywhere from what sort of like shape a sword can be, all the way up to you know, something to do with the background. But I mean, to bring it back onto the army itself, you know, Phil's challenge really was to make a set of rules for these things that was going to reflect the background and the visual image for it. So we tried to make sure that they had certain rule things that would work that way. We're not
literally the perfect segue into the next video clip.